This is Air Force Oral History Interview number 1361 with Otis F. Bryan. The interview dates are 14 and 15 December 1982, and the interview was conducted in Greeley, Kansas by Dr. James C. Hasdorf. This is tape 4 of 4, and both sides are recorded.
I suppose he meant from the Aleutian Islands across to Siberia, and then on southern Siberia down towards Afghanistan, Iran, out to the Persian Gulf. That was the line he wanted to operate, because that was much shorter than going around the other way across the Central Pacific, say, to that area. And of course, they really couldn't get down in that area because the Japs had all of those places down there at that time when MacArthur was trying to come up from Australia. So they wanted to have something to circle them on the north. However, we talked about that for an hour, hour and a half. And then it finally ended by he saying, well, I don't know. He said, I'll let you know. Otis said, I just doubt if I will ask you to do this, because if I did, he said, Jack Fry would get all over me. That was president of TWA. And he said, you're doing an important job where you are there. And he said, you keep that going. And he was very laudatory about the work we were doing and being able to take the people around, and how we were increasing the war effort and so forth. So those two things were about the only times I was ever really asked. Several people would say, well, why don't you come in and join us? You know, there's several of my friends in this service, but those are the only two areas where someone directly, as far as I know, asked for me to come in to the service on a permanent basis.
Well, from your own personal viewpoint, do you feel that your contribution was as great being in the position you were in, or how did you view that at the time?
Well, I never thought too much about it, but these people did. When they wanted to go, they called me personally and asked me to fly them. They didn't call anybody else. They wanted me, you know, I had maybe 25 or 30 pilots there, but they always wanted me to do it. So they must have had some kind of confidence in my ability in this area. And General Arnold said several times to Jack Fry, in my presence, what good work we were doing. And you saw the letter from the president for this. So to answer your question, it never occurred to me whether I could or could not. I just did what I was told to do, accepted these things. And the fact I was deferred and was not called to active duty on a permanent basis was because of the request the president of the company had, official request, to run this operation.
You mentioned off the tape about having some role in bringing the Doolittle Raiders out of China after their mission. Would you discuss that a little bit?
Yes. I don't know how many we brought. I know we brought Doolittle and several of his pilots. We sent a special plane over to Kunming in China. We went across Africa, India, and then up over the pass to Chongqing and Kunming. I think we picked them up at Kunming. It might have been Chongqing. And flew them from there back to Washington, D.C. I forget who was the pilot, but the pilot was quite impressed with the people, these pilots that made that raid, and had quite conversations with him and so forth. And Doolittle was quite unhappy. He was dejected because starting out with the raid, I think what they had was somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 planes. And
16, I think, actually went on the raid.
16? 16. Yeah, that's 16. And out of the 16, as far as he was concerned, they lost every one of them. They crash landed in China. The weather was bad. The ones that went to Russia, he counted out lost, and the other ones that landed. And he thought that when he said so, he thought when he arrived home, he'd probably be court-martialed. But he arrived home, and General Arnold made him commander of the 8th Air Force. It was the 8th Air Force in Europe, France. He was in charge of 8th Air Force.
I can't remember.
I can't remember my numbers so well. too many of those things. But he was commanding officer of one of the air forces in Europe, or the division. I talked to him several times in London. He's based in London.
What were your impressions of Doolittle?
Doolittle was basically sort of a wild type of an engineer. He was a good pilot, a good engineer. He was aggressive. He was always on the go-go. He was an intelligent man. I believe he was graduated from MIT, engineering. And he was popular and liked by the pilots. He was a pilot's pilot, let's put it that way. And he was about as wild as they were that came down the pike.
All right. Well, is there anything else you'd like to discuss about World War II before we move you into the post-war era?
No, I think I've covered the equipment. I've covered the pilots and some of the incidents that happened. There was one thing that, again, I might take just enough time to mention. It illustrates how a little simple change can affect, make a serious error someplace else. For instance, on the mail planes that we flew back in the early 30s, this plane each had two flares that you would drop when they land an emergency field or you needed to see some lights and or have the lights, see the ground. Well, use the lights. It was just a magnesium flare they'd drop with a parachute, and the magnesium flare would light up a mile or so around the airport when it's dark. They had one at each one stationed at each side of your foot. And to get them to release them, they had cables running around on a big chain. You'd pull the cable out hard, and that would pull the flare out. And as the flare went out, the case, which was about 4 inches in diameter and about 4 feet long, standing beside you, it would ignite the flare, and the parachute would open and float down, and you'd come around and land underneath it. Well, this time they thought that cable and everything, pulleys, was heavy, and they'd save a few pounds by taking that off and putting gunpowder in the top of the flare and an electric circuit to it so that you can ignite the gunpowder and it would blow the case out. And you wouldn't have all that extra weight. They practiced a few of these and it worked fine. But no one took into consideration what would happen if the gunpowder became damp. So I was trying to get into St. Louis one night with a load of mail and I couldn't, and I went back to the emergency field, New Florence, Missouri, to land, and they had about 400-foot ceiling, and I got under the ceiling and turned the gunpowder on, or the electric thing on to ignite the gunpowder. The gunpowder was damp and blew the flare down, not out of the case, but just far enough for it to ignite it. And that magnesium flare, you imagine how hot it was, started burning my foot, and my flying suit caught on fire, and the snow was about 6 inches deep on the ground, and I got down, the good Lord landed the plane for me, and I jumped out in the snow and got my fire put out, and got it, the airplane stopped. The airplane stopped, set the brakes, and got it, flare by that time had burned out, and got the mail sacks put out, so forth. But there was a case where someone just didn't think it through. They thought they could save a few pounds by putting this gunpowder in, but they didn't realize what had happened in rainy weather when it became damp. And those are the kind of things we had to learn. That's the way we learned in those days. So that was another example of that. But I think the rest of it, the main thing during that period of time was the foresight of Jack Fry, mainly, and then later joined by Howard Hughes. And they were the leaders in the airline industry, mainly from the technical and development and operation viewpoint, and followed by United, who was run by a banker, and American, who was run by ex-mechanic. They followed.
You mentioned off the tape that you felt that in some instances that Howard Hughes was depicted wrongly by the media and others. Would you like to discuss that a bit?
Yes, I think the media treated Howard Hughes very unfairly. In fact, I've described their action as technological inexactitudes. They seemed to take a man of Howard's standing, and they always wanted to write try to make the not the good side of the story, but the poor side of the story, whatever might be the bad story, side of the story, attribute to Howard. Howard was a very friendly person to those people he trusted. He was shy. He didn't trust many people. And the reason he didn't trust many people was that he had been taken by many people. And it cost him a lot of money over the days. And so he just would not associate with people unless he knew them, knew them well. He came to Washington. I flew with him in the Constellation, and I spent about a week taking care of him there in Washington and out with him and associated with him, and took him around places to see what he wanted to do there in Washington. He met General Arnold and these people, and he was decorated by the President. He received, I don't know whether he ever received or not, but he was decorated by the President for the work he's done. He told me one time that when he inherited Hughes Tool Company, that it was valued at $300,000. And he said he had made it, taken that $300,000 and made it into the big, huge company of millions and millions that it was at that time. And he said he had problems along the way, many of them. And he said one of his major problems then was in Hollywood. As a matter of fact, he didn't say that. I asked him why he always worked at night. He would call you when he wanted to talk to me. He'd call me on the phone between 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I asked him why he worked at night. He said, well, he said, if I go out to the plant in the daytime, he said, I'm pestered by all kinds of people. They want to talk to me. He said, I can't get anything done. And he said, I can go out there at 8, 9, or 10 o'clock at night and work till daylight, and no one bothers me, and get something done. And he says, that's why I do it. He was a very sensitive type of person. He was very personal. If he were here at the table, you'd enjoy talking to him. He'd chat just like we would once he had his conference. And he had all these other problems, and he had a Hughes Tool Company he was building, and he was buying many areas around Los Angeles for TV towers. TV was just coming in, one of those high points, which he purchased. He purchased much land around Tucson. He has a big area there, Las Vegas and all this. And he was directing things himself, besides the TWA thing, which he spent a lot of time on, he and Jack Fry building the Constellation, which I covered yesterday. So, to answer your question, I think he was treated very unfairly by the media. They didn't give him credit for all these fine things he did for aviation and the chances he took. And you take the main instance is the Spruce Goose. This is worthy of note, if I may take a few moments to tell you this. I happened to be in Washington when some of this took place, and I was involved in part of it. In fall of 1942, yes, in the fall of 1942, early 43, we flew on the Cairo trip. We flew down to Miami, then Miami to Trinidad, Trinidad to Belém to Natal, Natal to Ascension, then to Bathurst, then over to Lagos, and then over to Cairo, across the center. Stop when you get over to the Nile, we'd stop at Khartoum. And from Washington, after he got south, I saw ship after ship of Americans that was sunk along the harbor with the German subs. I think few people realize how close the subs brought the war to the United States. But I saw them down in the harbor at Trinidad. There were 3 or 4 hulks just there where they just sunk them in the harbor. I mention that because that was the basic reason for it building the Spruce Goose. General Arnold called Howard Hughes and said, we want to build a large flying boat made out of wood. We want it to build rapidly. We want it to carry a large number of troops, because now, at this point, in late 42, early 43, 42 I guess was, late 42, we don't believe we'll be able to get our troops over to Europe by surface vessel. He said, we think we're going to have to fly them, because he said the subs are just sinking everything we have out there. So he said, we want somebody who can move rapidly to do this and build a prototype. 4 engine, 5, 6 engine, whatever we want, but we want it to carry 200 or 300 troops. And we don't care whether it's slow or how slow it is, but we want to be so you can build them quickly and get a large number in the air to get these troops over there. So Howard said, fine, but he talked to, I'm not sure how it came about, but the other fellow, Kaiser, was made part of it. So then, in about the spring of 1944, 40, somewhere thereabouts, with our aircraft, submarine, and with our Navy, we'd cleaned out most of the subs, and we were able to establish the convoys, and was shipping stuff with reasonable safety to Europe by convoy. So the Air Force General Marshal, I don't know whether General Marshal or staff or whether they did it right field, called Howard in and said they would have no further use for the Spruce Goose, because they were able now, things had changed, and they were able to take the troops across by surface convoy now, and they were taking them across no problem, so they wouldn't have any further use of that. Well, Howard asked, well, he said, that being the case, we're fairly well along building this. Would you object if I spent my own money and completed a Spruce Goose? He said, we think it'll take between $10, $15 million. And he said, no, that's fine. So Howard took his own money and completed the Spruce Goose, and he was vain enough, he wanted to fly it, flew it on that short flight. Now, the press and the media you're speaking of got all over him about the Spruce Goose, the money he wasted on the Spruce Goose, so forth. But he spent $10, $15 million of his own getting that plane, finishing it, because he wanted to, that was his pride, and building it just in order to fly it, make it flyable. He stopped immediately when the government said to stop. He did what the government said to do and asked him to do, and he did it in a short space of time. But no time was he ever given credit. He was criticized severely for the Spruce Goose. That was not justified. Other cases of similar nature. It seemed to be that the media just wanted to make him out wrong each time rather than give him any credit for the good things he had done.
Do you have any idea why that was the case?
Yes, I think it was because Howard wouldn't talk to the press. He wouldn't talk to the media. They'd always want interviews, and he wouldn't talk to them. He had a fellow named Bill Gay at 7000 Romaine Avenue in Los Angeles. And you never could call Howard on the phone. You would call Bill Gay and then stand by, and if Howard wanted to talk to you, he would return your call. And he did that in Washington. He'd always have an operator. You could never call him. You'd call and tell you who you were, what you wanted to talk about, and Howard, or give him a little information. And then you'd hang up, and they'd take the number, and then if Howard wanted to talk to you, he'd call you back. Now, I think that, well, if the press, you've had experience with the press. You know, if you don't talk to them, cooperate with them, then they try to start making the news instead of reporting it.
What do they call that? Advocacy journalism?
Something of that nature.
All right. According to the articles you showed me yesterday, you stayed with TWA until 1948.
Yes.
What was the reason you decided to leave them at that particular time?
We were having difficulties, the airline. The other people, Jack Fry, President, Paul Richter, and Vin Conroy, Lee Tallman, all other officers resigned in 1946. And they were my friends, and Jack Fry was the one that gave me all the opportunities in TWA and made me an officer of the company, gave me the opportunity that I had. And in the meantime, during World War II, that war took quite a strain. Took quite a bit out of you. 4 years or the way we had to go, practically 7 days a week and so forth. And the company physician at that time told me that I'd better ease up or I was headed for some real trouble. That was one phase. The other phase was getting back that my friends were gone and they had a new man in there that was not the easiest fellow in the world to get along with. He knew nothing about the airline, but he was in a deciding position where he made the decisions, and sometimes they were good, but most of the time they were not. In the meantime, Colonel Soriano, Andre Soriano, who was an internationalist and had quite a few holdings in the Pacific area, had come to Washington in about 1944. And he came in Mr. Fry's office, and my office was right next to his, right next to Mr. Fry. And he told Mr. Fry that he wanted to, after the war, said previously he had a small airline in the Philippines. And just as soon as the war was over, he wanted to reactivate this airline, and he needed some personnel to do it. So Jack talked to him for a little while, and then it was his habit. He brought him in. He said, well, Otis will handle the details here of this and talk to you and discuss it and tell you what you think you need and so forth. So he started talking, tell me about his airline, where he started to run and how many fields and what size he'd like to have and so forth. And he said he'd need personnel. He wanted maintenance personnel, salespeople, chief hostess, chief pilots, and you can get pilots out there, but he didn't need some supervisory pilots, mechanics, inspectors, and all you need to run an airline. So I made him up a list, and he came back in a day or two and told him that I thought he would need about 32 people, and I gave each one and I didn't give them a name, I just the title and what they would do very briefly. He agreed. He thought that would be about right, and he said, how long would it take you to get them out there after I gave you the notice? And I said, well, I think we can get them out there right away because we'd have an excess of people coming back from the service, you know, and so forth. And when it was, this was in 1944, I guess 44. So in 1945, when the war was over, he sent me a cable. He was Colonel on MacArthur's staff down in Australia. Colonel Soriano was. And he sent me a cable that he was going back to the Philippines. He was ready for these people, and he'd need them as soon as he got up there, and he'd send me another cable when he arrived. Well, he said, in the meantime, start lining them, doing the necessary. So I got him the 32 people and had them ready to go when he called me back, or when he sent me a cable back. And then we shipped him out there, and they were good people. It's like people who say, people who had to stay at home during World War II. They saw this as an opportunity to go someplace, after the war. And we sent Ruby McCullough went out in charge of the hostess. You remember her? Yeah, it was Ruby Williams. And so that greatly impressed him. He was very much impressed, Soriano was, that I could get this number of people, get them on the way out there in practically no time at all when he gave the signal. He was a Spaniard. He was raised in Spain. He graduated from the London School of Economics, and he had great holdings in that area. And he had never seen hardly that kind of service before. So as a result of that, in the meantime, we were having problems in TWA. Jack Fry, as I mentioned, and the other officers resigned. And when they resigned, Howard called me and asked me to stay on for a year and asked me if I would. And then things got more difficult as we went along. So in the meantime, Colonel Soriano had been writing me personal notes asking me if I wouldn't come out to the Philippines. And the TWA doctor that had the Albuquerque, I'll think of his name in a few moments. He had quite a hospital around Albuquerque there, specialist. I forget his name, but he was a young fellow. He was TWA physician. So he was a good friend of mine. He said, "You better slow up." He said, "You're going to have a breakdown if you're not careful," because we were nervous, you know, after 4 years' work like that. And in summary, those were the reasons I went. It was Colonel Soriano had offered me this position, considerably more money I was making TWA. I was having problems internally with TWA management. These are the things that attributed to it, so I decided to go.
Did you get any retirement out of the TWA?
No. 19 years, never got no retirement.
That was kind of rough, wasn't it?
Well, it would have been nice, but aviation has been good to us, kind to many of us.
Where did Jack Fry and these other officers go when they left TWA?
Jack Fry and Paul Richter went with the Grace Company down near your place somewhere. Where is Grace located? Atlanta? Grace Company, shipping company, big, huge shipping company. Grace. They went with them for a few months. And, excuse me, wait a minute, I'm in error, wrong. Jack Fry became president of General Aniline Film Corporation in New York. He went from TWA, General Aniline Film Corporation, New York. Paul Richter went with the Grace Company and stayed there a few months, and then went to and died, passed away. Jack Fry was with the General Aniline Film Corporation several years. Then he went into other business, small manufacturing, and in early 1959 he was killed in an automobile accident in Tucson, Arizona. And Vin Conroy, he was the vice president of traffic. He became a vice president of the Avis Corporation. And Lee Tomlin, who was a senior vice president, executive vice president, became executive vice president of part of Coca-Cola someplace, a big position in Coca-Cola in New York.
Well, you were involved with any number of things when you went to work for Andres Soriano. You helped farm the Philippine Airlines over in the Philippines. And then you wound up head of a brewery.
Yes.
Back here later on. Would you discuss that some?
Well, when I went out to the Philippines, I was a vice president of Soriano and Company, Soriano ECA, which is your Spanish Soriano and Company. Soriano and Company had a management contract with the he owned the biggest part of it, with Philippine Airlines to management. And my position as an officer of Soriano and Company was that of an executive vice president of the airline. As a vice president of Soriano and Company. I'm not making this too clear, but it was an unusual situation. This worked out very well, because every day I would meet with Colonel Soriano and have a discussion with him about the airline operation. Then I was a director of the brewery. He had breweries out there, and Coca-Cola franchise, and lumber concessions, gold mines, and developing and tried to develop an oil fields, and many things. And he had holdings in South Africa. So we stayed out there for 2 years, and I helped in some of these other areas besides the airline. It was a little broader than just that. Then I came back here, and he asked me to come back here and take over some of these things, and this, including the Mulebach Brewery, and then he had interest in oil in Canada, and then he had a trading company in New York, and I was a part of the management of these other things as well as the brewery here. But my main thing was getting the brewery going again. He'd had problems with it in Kansas City. So I spent about 7 years with him in that area, and then the brewery was sold to Slits, and then later on I went up and joined Singer, General Precision at that time.
Well, did you become an accomplished brewmeister during that period?
No. I had a very good brewmaster, but my problem was more in getting the finances and the sales and the marketing end of it up, which in this area. And we came from 5th place to 1st place in Kansas City in about 3 years. So we were successful in that.
Well, what brand beer was it? Mulebach?
Mulebach.
I've vaguely heard of the name, but was it just mainly marketed in the Kansas City area?
No, it is marketing in Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. We had a big market in Texas.
I don't remember that. I'm from Texas, and I never heard of it, down where I was anyway.
Where were you located? Maybe
San Antonio and
No,
South.
we didn't get San Antonio later. This is in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Waco area. We had substantial sales, and Houston, Houston, in that area northeast, Longview. You know where Longview is?
Oh, yes.
We had a distributor there. We had, in the county, it was just one county that you could sell beer in that area. That was the only county. And there were 100 outlets in there. And we had our beer in 99 of them.
Well, didn't this seem a little peculiar that you had such a long history of being in the executive business with airlines and suddenly find yourself handling beer sales?
Well, I'm not sure that the word peculiar would describe it. When I was in the Philippines, I began to see, under Soriano, some of his objectives and policies of handling business. And his theory was that if you studied things very carefully and then used good common sense, you would make a good decision. But if you didn't study it carefully, you weren't practical, there's no way in the world you were going to make a good decision. And he had confidence, and that's what we did in the airline, and that's what we did in the lumber business down there. You had in the gold mines, we had certain changes we had to make. Particularly, most of my work was with the airlines. And for example, when I went there, they had Army surplus equipment. They had about 60 DC-3s, C-47s out of the surplus Air Force, and they had about 3 DC-6s and some C-54s. And the maintenance area was very poor, very substandard. And the airplanes were having difficulty. They'd go out and get something wrong with them, come back. Sometimes they'd go out 2 or 3 times before they'd make their first flight to the first stop. So after I saw what was happening, and then I made up a plan that we would get a surplus hangar, buy it from the military, set it up, and build us an area where we could give good maintenance and get a few good mechanics from the States over there to train these Filipinos. We had plenty of Filipino maintenance men out of the Air Force, but they didn't have supervision. And that would cost, at that time, the total cost of that was around $100,000. So when I took that plan into him, and I told him, I thought, here's what to do to eliminate this problem. He asked many questions, and then he approved it. And he said, go ahead and handle it. And we did. We got everything done under $100,000, and we got the airlines going right on schedule. We got the maintenance. We took, instead of having 60 airplanes, I cut it down, I think, to 24 or 25, but made those good airplanes where we had them in good shape, maintenance otherwise. They were good and reliable. And things went just on clockwork, and we had quite a name for ourselves of operating on schedule out there in that area. So with that experience in the airline, I began to do some things like that in these other divisions. And that's when he asked me then to, he was having trouble with the brewery here, and he wanted me to come back and take it over and see what we could do about it.
Well, he had a diversified interest in investing, didn't he?
Yeah. So to answer your question, when I went from I didn't go directly from the airline to the brewery. I had these other things in the background which I had the confidence Soriano to do, and that made it much easier.
Did you work on a straight salary, or did you work on a commission basis while you worked for him?
Straight salary and expenses and other things. We had a out there everything was furnished. We had a house, and his and car and chauffeur, and everything was furnished by the company. You know, and it didn't cost you anything to live out there.
How did your family like living in the Philippines?
Oh, they got along fairly good. Lee didn't like it. She got a little homesick a time or two. Kids loved it. They were about, what, 10, 12 years old? Yeah. Skippy and Sis. Yeah. Well, they were born in 35 and 37. We were out there in 48 and 50. So they were 10, 12 years old.
Well, did you have any regrets going with Soriano, or did you find it rewarding?
No, I found it very well. I found I don't think I could ever done some of the other things that I did if I hadn't had that experience with Soriano, because he graduated London School of Economics, and the vast success in business he had, I got some quite different ideas on how to run a business directly from him.
What became of Soriano?
He was a chain smoker. He developed cancer and died about a week later in 1967.
Too bad.
When he was 66 years old.
Well, what was the occasion for your next move then over to the Singer Corporation?
Well, when we sold out to Slits, sold the brewery, well, of course, they took over, and I didn't want to go on the brewery any longer. So I was looking around for some other connections, and these people up at Binghamton, General Precision at that time, which owned the Link simulators, they were having trouble with the airlines. And I had a friend up there, and he asked me to come up, and I first went up there to stay only a year or so, and I stayed almost 15. So my position there was vice president, assistant to the president. And my main job there was these large contracts we had in various countries, in Europe and in Australia and Japan, South Africa. I represented the president, and whenever the sales department got a big contract up so far, then I would come in, move in, and make the final decisions and conclude the contract with the French Air Force or the Australian Air Force or the Mitsubishi in Tokyo. And I did an extreme amount of traveling out of Binghamton.
How did you like the cold winters of Binghamton, New York.
Not very well. That does get cold back there.
And you say you spent 15 years at...
14 years, something.
14 years?
Something, yeah. Almost 15.
And beside Link Trainers, what else were you involved in with?
Well, we were involved in the space program down at Houston. We had 600 engineers down there to do the maintenance for the space program at Houston. We did a lot of work in this area, particularly in the computer field. Simulators were large, were getting large there. 2 or 3 million, they're now $6 or $7 million piece of equipment, a good simulator. And it's very advanced, and this was used large computers, and we did much work for training the people in the space program and for the computers used in the space program. We also took care of all the space program's equipment at Houston.
Johnson Space Center?
Yeah. Had 600 engineers there. We still do, as far as I know. I'm in touch with them lately.
Did you get to witness any of the space flights?
Yes, I saw out of Florida. I remember one I saw. The takeoff, you mean?
Yes.
It's quite interesting to see that, the speed at which it gets out of there from the ground.
And it was at this time then you decided to go into a full retirement. Is that correct?
Yes, when I reached 65, they had a mandatory retirement age of 65. So that's when I came out here, permanent basis. We bought this place in 1964. And I had my man here, and Lee was down here most of the summers. She liked it down here. And then I retired in 1973.
Well, why did you, in particular, decide on this area?
Well, I owned a place up near Kansas City, a little town near Stillwell. And I had cattle on it and so forth. And the Kansas City Power and Light Company wanted it to build a huge substation there on that property. I did not want to sell, but they had the threat of condemnation, which the utilities have if I didn't sell to them. So they wanted 40 acres right out of the middle of my place. Well, to make a long story short, they sent me a letter of threatening condemnation on the whole thing. I sold the whole thing to them with an agreed price. And when I sold that, I had a year then to invest that money. It was a substantial amount of profit from what I paid for it without paying the income tax on it. So I saw this place advertised, and I came down here first, and it was, I liked the area and I liked the place, but the buildings and everything were fairly crummy. The fields had gone up, fences, stuff like that. So anyway, I bought this place in summer '64, and then it took us quite a while to get the deed and everything straightened out and get full control. And in '65, why, I moved some cattle in here and started work on it, fix it up. I had this house. This house was built in 1857 by Major General Blount, B-L-O-U-N-T. He was quite a Civil War general.
Union or?
Yes, Kansas, here. And it was a fairly large house, as you can see, and it had 10 rooms. They were cut up fairly small rooms. So we had to remodel the whole house, and we added 2 rooms, and we wound up with 6 rooms here. The basement, he built this in the late 50s. Missouri was a slave state, and Kansas was a free state. And they would get the slaves out of Missouri at night, bring them over here and keep them in the basement here during the day, and then run them on out western Kansas, toward western Kansas the next night. And they had quite a few clashes around here where the people would come over from Missouri trying to get the slaves, and John Brown, this was his area. His lookout is a mountain right over here where they call John Brown Lookout. And they had a lot of skirmishes, a lot of massacres in this general area where the free people in Kansas were fighting the pro-slavery people in Missouri.
Yeah, this was quite a bloodbath around
Yes.
here for some time.
So we fixed the house up. I said we have 6 rooms and made it modern and put in a furnace and 3.5 baths and did a lot of insulation and rebuilding and so forth.
You acquired more land too as time went on.
Yes,
didn't you?
we have now almost 1,000 acres of land we own, and we lease about 2,000 acres for cattle.
How many head of cattle do you have now?
Well, we have about 290 cows in the young stock, but maybe 300 young stock.
Well, have you always had a yearning to be in the farming and ranching business?
Well, I always wanted to raise cattle, but actually I just simply didn't have time to do it until I retired.
Is this from your youth?
Yes, I was born and raised on a farm back in southern Indiana.
That's quite a diverse interest, aircraft to ranching, I would think.
Well, I think in your declining years, you ought to do what you like to do, regardless of what it is. Some people like to raise cattle, some people like to go skiing, some people like to fish, some people like to play golf, some people like to sit around.
And according to one of the articles, you made an address before the Sertoma Club of Kansas City in 1952. What kind of club is this Sertoma Club?
So that's a national organization that at that time was, and it's quite an important club. It was the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce or Advertising Club or
Lions Club?
Lions Club, and then 400 or 500 people.
How did they receive your talk that you gave that time?
Well, they were, at that time, there was substantial interest in, still in the World War II picture of the people of Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin. And they all wanted to have a sort of a personal description of these people that I had met and talked to and seen, of the 3. And so I think the one you're referring to, I gave a talk there on Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt as I knew them, or something to that effect, and described the trips and what kind of people they were and what they said and what they did. And they were very, very interested, and they received it very well. I had had previous training in public speaking, 3 years at the Advertising and Sales Club in Kansas City. I was president of the Advertising and Sales Club for 2 years in Kansas City while I was there. And of course we had weekly luncheon meeting, in which I presided for the 2 years. Had quite a bit of experience in this area.
Do you still give talks before any groups?
Well, less and less all the time. I do, yes. Yes, I gave one at Aviation Day in St. Louis, and I gave one for the Lions Club in Kansas City, and I gave one before the Retired Pilots Association, 600 or 700 people, and probably 1 or 2 every year I get trapped into giving one. It's always easy to say, that they ask you to speak and you can demur and get away from it. They say, well, this won't be till next summer. And you think, well, by next summer they'll forget it. But the rascals, they never forget it.
Well, that's about all the questions I have. Are there any areas or topics that I haven't discussed that you'd like to bring out?
Well, my most cherished thing, and the thing during my experience in World War II were these 5 individuals in these pictures here I've shown you. I cherish them more. I cherish the letter I received from President Roosevelt on the work I was doing. There's several letters in the scrapbook from Eisenhower, from Mark Clark, Secretary of War Lovett, along the same order. Those are the kind of things that mean much to me now. When I received them, I didn't think too much of them. I thought, well, it's just another letter, but as time goes on, they assume a much greater importance. This period that I've been in aviation from 1927 until now, I'm still a consultant with the Singer Company, has been, I think, the greatest area in history in which to live. If you read your history, there's no other time where you had as much advancement as we've had in this time frame. You take the aircraft, the airlines have developed. From a tri-motor Ford traveling 100 miles an hour and carrying 10 passengers, to the Concorde traveling supersonic speeds, carrying 200 or 300 passengers. We've also seen the development of the jet engine by Mr. Whipple in England. This has added to the development of the jet aircraft now for the past year. We've seen the airlines develop into a huge, terrific business. We've seen the spaceships, and as sure as time goes by, there will be a big development in that area. It may not be too soon, but it's just a question of time. All of these things, the other developments that have occurred, you take in the medical field. Here you're reading, hearing on TV this morning about Mr. Clark up in Utah has a mechanical heart and is still living. He's in critical condition, but he's still living. Take the development of penicillin, all the other developments. So aviation has not only been kind to many of us, although there were many that didn't come through. In the early days of TWA pilots, we lost 5% of our pilots every year by crashes. And many pilots, but aviation has been extremely kind to us. And in addition, we've been living in one of the greatest areas the world has ever known. You look back at the other things, and the major thing is World War II, where the whole world was at war. And we've lived through that. We're having our lumps now on the economic conditions, but they will be solved. So, in summary, I think the world has been very kind to us, and to us in aviation, extremely kind over this period. And I'm happy to have been a part of it.
As one final aside there, you mentioned Mr. Lovett a couple of times. What was your appreciation for this gentleman?
Mr. Lovett was Secretary of War for Air during World War II. He liked to travel. He was a very friendly person, quite modest and polite, dignified type, educated individual. I enjoyed him. I enjoyed talking to him. And I flew him on 2 or 3 of his trips overseas. He asked me to personally fly him, which I did. Most of those people at that time, once I got to flying the president, well, they all wanted me to fly him if I possibly could, and I tried to oblige them if there's any way in the world to. And particularly those people like Mr. Lovett and the generals and admirals at the top there with President Roosevelt. He was an excellent, wonderful guy, in my opinion.
Most people that I've talked to had a very high appreciation of Mr. Lovett.
He was probably one of the best educated and most intelligent overall people that I've met. One of the best. There's several of them, of course. He's one of the best.
All right. If you don't have anything further, that concludes my questions, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Air Force Oral History Program and the Office of Air Force History.
Well, thank you very much, and may I thank you for coming up here this long way from Alabama, and the time you spent here and getting this, and your patience and listening to all this stuff. and I want to thank you and the Air Force for you doing so.
All right, thank you. This concludes Air Force Oral History Interview number 1361 with Otis F. Bryan. The interview dates are 14 and 15 December 1982, and the interview was conducted in Greeley, Kansas by Dr. James C. Hasdorf.